Now, in today's discussion starter video, I'm going to be talking as plainly and as honestly as I can about the current state of the Star Wars franchise and what the problem Kathleen Kennedy, president of Lucasfilm, has on her hands. A problem many feel she is in large part or even entirely responsible for. And even if you're someone who has loved and approved of all things, and are a fan of all four of the Star Wars movies to come out under the Disney banner thus far, it cannot be denied, especially after Solo's dismal showing thus far at the box office, where it's making roughly half of what Rogue One did, that many are turning away from Star Wars, and that a giant rift has formed in the fan base, and something akin to all-out war is taking place. And in one of my more recent videos, I tried to make the argument that the number of people that were rejecting this new iteration of Star Wars under Disney is quite significant and widespread across all levels of the fandom, but many people, and this is likely my fault for not articulating my argument well enough, thought I was trying to downplay the impact fans have had on the opening weekend box office numbers of Solo, when I was just trying to do the opposite actually, and argue that they had a huge impact on it, but that it wasn't just because a group of fans decided to actively boycott this movie. Yes, the call to boycott played its part and convinced some not to go and see it, there's no doubt about that. But by and large, the fanbase didn't turn out for this movie for a wide variety of reasons other than just the rallying cries of a few on the internet. And no, I'm not trying to belittle the efforts of those who championed that cause. I'm simply saying it's much bigger than just a call for a boycott, considering most fans who chose not to see this movie, those who don't keep up with all things Star Wars on a daily basis, likely never heard anything about a boycott. They simply didn't go and see it because they didn't want to see it. Which gets us back to the real problem Kathleen Kennedy now faces. Star Wars fans, in some cases lifelong fans who fell in love with it back in 1977, are giving up on the franchise after 40 plus years of devotion. The core of this long-standing fanbase is withering away. Those who used to almost automatically consume all things Star Wars are becoming disenfranchised, and both refraining from seeing the new movies in the theater and letting the merchandise from said movies rot on store shelves. And it's not just the fallout from one bad movie, which many will argue The Last Jedi was. It's something much bigger than that. It is a sense of disconnect or lack of respect between those bringing us these movies and those who once ravenously consumed them. And the blame for that, like it or not, fair or not, has to start at the top. It has to start with the one running the show, Kathleen Kennedy. And no, this isn't where I launch into a tirade about her, nor am I going to presume to know what her political agenda may or may not be for Star Wars. The only thing on that I will say is that I think it's obvious there's been a concerted effort on her part to get more women involved in Star Wars and to bring more female fans into the fold. And that's not inherently a bad thing. Star Wars movies have always been lacking in female characters, and I don't think anyone will argue that. But I don't think it's ever been lacking in female fans. And had they simply put more good, well thought out female characters in the story, you would have never heard anyone complain about it. Instead, we get characters like Vice Admiral Holdo, who feels like she was inserted into the story just because she was a woman. And again, if you want to give us good female characters and develop them within the story, that's fine and even encouraged. And I don't know if you know this or not, Kathleen Kennedy, but male fans love a good female character. We do. The old expanded universe was chocked full of them, and never once in all the time I followed the EU did I ever hear fans grumble about the female characters. Quite the opposite, actually. Or take a show like the Clone Wars. Two of my favorite characters from that show were Ahsoka Tano and Asajj Ventress. Why? Because they were given amazing story arcs. And despite hating Ahsoka at the start and thinking Ventress was little more than a cookie-cutter villain, by the end I found myself caring about the fate of both those characters because they had become so much more than what they started out as. They had been given a story that I could relate to and had endeared themselves to me. While Holdo, on the other hand, I don't know if an attempt was even made to make us truly care about her. And yes, I get it's not easy to make us care about a character in the span of one movie, especially in a Star Wars movie where there are other characters that are going to get a lot more screen time. But it can still be done. And if it can't, then you need to re-examine your script. And you need to find a way to give that moment where she uses hyperspace to crash the Raddus into the Supremacy, the emotional impact to match the physical impact we saw on screen. Because when that happened, all I thought to myself was, wow, that looked cool, but why has no one ever done something like this before? I didn't care at all that Hodel had just sacrificed herself. I was just worried about the implications to the continuity. And the sad part is there was actually a ridiculously simple and obvious fix for all of this right in front of you that would have been appreciated by a lot of fans. And that is, instead of jettisoning Admiral Akbar out into space without a shred of fanfare, get rid of Holdo entirely and have him take her place. And then instead of Akbar using hyperspace as a weapon, which many have an issue with considering we would have seen something like this before, just have him put all power to the forward shields and fly head on at the supremacy. You could have accomplished the same thing more or less in terms of progressing the story when it crashed into the supremacy, but you also could have given Akbar, a fan favorite, a fitting and memorable ending, and you wouldn't have broken continuity for the sake of having a pretty shot in your movie. And this, Kathleen Kennedy, Lucasfilm, and Disney, is one of the many reasons people don't like what you're doing with Star Wars. You gave us a pointless new character when an old one would have worked far better, and then you gave this character no one liked or cared about, and the fact that it was a female character is completely irrelevant. A spectacular death scene that now calls into question the tactics of every previous Star Wars battle we've ever seen. Way to go. Any fan who took a look at that script ahead of time would have said, "What in the hell is this?" Which really makes me wonder what in the world is going on at Lucasfilm right now, because no doubt a vast majority of the people who work there are huge Star Wars fans. So, did none of them voice their concerns about this movie ahead of time, or did they just get ignored? I mean, considering all the comments Mark Hamill made before the movie came out, he clearly saw this coming. So how did no one else associated with Lucasfilm see this? How did no one at Lucasfilm read the script long before it ever went into production and warn them that they were going to lose a lot of fans because they weren't going to like this movie? Or again, did they just get ignored because Kathleen and Ryan knew best? And honestly, I think this stems from the fact that Kathleen Kennedy is not a huge Star Wars fan. I don't think she gets it or cares about it on the same level that a lot of the fans do. And I'm not calling into question her intelligence, because clearly she is a smart, capable, and savvy businesswoman. I'm just calling her passion for Star Wars into question. I'm calling into question that she is someone who would live and breathe Star Wars if it wasn't for the position she was in. Because a lot of people are deeply passionate about Star Wars. If this last few months of controversy in the wake of The Last Jedi has proven anything, it's proven that. So if the one at the helm of the franchise doesn't share that passion, and doesn't care about the story itself as much as those who want to consume it, then the franchise is probably destined for failure. And I know some of you will race to the comments and say that suggesting Kathleen Kennedy is not a fan of Star Wars is utterly ridiculous. Of course she's a fan. I mean, why else would George Lucas have picked her, right? Well, I think Lucas picked her because he thought she could run the company and run it well. He probably thought she would surround herself with people who did have a deep passion for Star Wars, and that would help her and guide her. Maybe he also picked her because he thought she'd listen to him, that from the sidelines George himself could still call a few plays, if you will, and be involved in the creation process still. We do after all know that Lucas gave her ideas for this new trilogy, but they got rejected, and that Lucas did seem quite bitter about that. Really though, the biggest problem right now is the disconnect between the fans and those running the show. We're simply not being listened to or having our concerns addressed. Instead, we're given excuses as to why the movie was so harshly criticized by the fandom, like with The Last Jedi, or why it's underperforming at the box office, like with Solo, instead of them admitting that maybe, just maybe, they're not giving us the movies we want. And I know some of you will then argue that, who are we to tell them what we want out of the movies? By doing so, we're taking away their artistic freedom. Well, we're the customers. We're the ones giving them our money for a product we want, not one they just want to give us. And that being said, they still have every right to express their artistic freedom however they choose with these movies and the stories within them, as we have every right to say no thank you to it, and to criticize something they expected us to pay our hard-earned money to consume. And as someone who's worked in the restaurant industry for years now, this is all such a strange argument to me, because people go to, say, an Italian restaurant because they want good Italian food. They don't want someone's unique interpretation of what Italian food should or could be. They want the real deal. It's no different than people going to a Star Wars movie and wanting the Star Wars they've always known and loved, not someone else's interpretation of what it should now become. And even though the chef back in the kitchen might love to try something new and different, and let me tell you, most chefs do think of themselves as a type of artist, they know most of the customers want the same old thing they've been coming to the restaurant for years. And though the customers might be open to some slight tweaks and changes here and there to a dish, or occasionally getting something completely different off the menu, they still want what they came to the restaurant for in the first place. They want good Italian food. Just like Star Wars fans want good Star Wars movies, not what someone else thinks Star Wars should be. And I know that's a pretty basic and silly analogy, but I think it makes the point and it makes it well about what happened with The Last Jedi. It wasn't the movie people wanted or expected, and you can't then criticize those who didn't like it because it wasn't what they wanted. The same way you couldn't criticize someone who went to an Italian restaurant and got served Mexican food. Simply put, it's not what they came for. Sure, maybe it's great Mexican food, and maybe a lot of people loved it, even more so than the Italian food they expected. But if it's not what some people wanted, and if they choose to voice their objections, those at the other tables who did like it shouldn't look at them and say that they just can't appreciate good, sophisticated Mexican food because they're so used to the simple, bland Italian food. Nor should the ownership of that restaurant come to the conclusion that they must hate Mexican food, and that's the only reason they won't come back to their restaurant anymore. When in reality, people didn't like The Last Jedi for a whole bunch of different reasons, not the least of which is they didn't like the way it treated the character of Luke Skywalker, and that it took the story not only The Force Awakens had set up, but the previous two trilogies, and veered it down a whole different path. And it did it seemingly just for the sake of not being what anyone expected. It subverted expectations not to serve the story, but to seemingly make a point about fan expectations, to almost blatantly tell the fans that what they want doesn't matter, or in other words, to tell the customers, we're going to give you what we want, not what you want, and if you don't like it, hey, that's on you. And look, there was probably a time and a place for a divisive Star Wars movie that shook up the entire franchise. In fact, I think most fans really want something new and completely different out of Star Wars from time to time. And part of the failure of Solo can be attributed to fans not wanting the same old thing. They want movies away from the time period of the original trilogy. The problem is, though, many fans feel that Episode 8 and the character of Luke Skywalker was not the time and the place to make a divisive change. You took their favorite dish, the reason they loved your restaurant in the first place, and you radically changed it. And you may love Episode 8 and Luke in that movie, and that's fine, but a lot of people didn't, and they're not wrong for feeling that way, just like you're not wrong for liking it. And a lot of those people who didn't like The Last Jedi spoke with their wallets and didn't go to see Solo. And the question I now ask of all of you is, how can Star Wars be fixed? Because right now, even if they're not willing to publicly admit it, the fans do have the high ground. And though I personally enjoyed the movie, it can't be denied that Solo was an utter failure at the box office and was rejected by the fans. Which means Lucasfilm can either double down again, ignore fans, and make Episode 9 and risk another disaster, or they can start to heed the cries of the fans, or their customers, and try to do right by them. But here's the thing about that. A lot of fans have now gone way to the extreme with their hatred of Kathleen Kennedy, and that's not going to help either. Just screaming for blood isn't going to get them to listen to you. Change is only going to come about when both sides sit down and have constructive dialogue. And now that the fans have struck a blow against Disney and Lucasfilm, where they'll notice it, which is financially, it's time to set aside your anger and tell them why you didn't go to see Solo, or what you think is wrong with Star Wars right now, or even what you love about Star Wars right now, in a civilized manner. Now, this might be the silliest idea I've ever had, or silliest idea since putting a restaurant analogy in a Star Wars video, and it probably won't change a damn thing in the long run. But as someone who loves Star Wars and hates what's happening to the fan base, I have to try and do something. So I'm going to create a video that is an open letter addressed to Disney where I simply read what fellow fans have to say about the current state of the franchise and how they think it can be fixed. And if you're one of those people who love all things Star Wars under Disney, I'd love to hear from you too, and we'll read your comments as well. So if you'd like to participate, even if you think this is a futile effort, then head to the comments below and start a comment by saying, "Dear Disney," and I know it's not just you commenting on this video. And all I ask for you to do is to be as rational and concise as possible. I know some of you might have a lot to say, but try to keep it on the shorter side. And being passionate is fine and encouraged, but spewing hate and profanity is not. Try to write it as if you were actually talking to some of the execs at Disney and or Lucasfilm, because maybe, just maybe, some of them, or even just one of them, might watch the video and we can start to heal this broken fandom. And again, I know this might be a silly idea and nothing might ever come of it, but like Luke told Leia about saving their father in Return of the Jedi, I have to try. Well, that's all I've got for you this time. Now it's your turn to take to the comments below and tell me what you think either about this video or the idea itself, or on ways to heal the broken franchise and fan base. And if you'd like to take part in this open letter video to Disney, please again start your comment by saying, "Dear Disney." Furthermore, if you got the time, please read through some of the comments that start that way and give a like or feedback to those that you either agree with or that you think should be read in the video. Anyway, leave your comments below and let's see what we can do about this franchise we all love. And let's talk some Star Wars. And until next time, thanks for watching.